she wore to keep herself warm. There had been various attempts to knock some sense into John Fraser's head with regard to Maggie's education, but no one really tried very hard, because John Fraser could be quite frightening. And, anyway, Maggie was only a girl, and everyone knew education was wasted on mere girls whose sole function in life was to marry and beget children. Maggie pulled her shawl over her head as the rain poured down. How long the road seemed. The one afternoon a week when the shop closed early was her only time of freedom. Her father went off somewhere every Wednesday afternoon, returning late and drunk. Maggie never knew where he went, and she could not imagine him at some inn, propping up the bar amid the cheerful clatter of glasses and conversation of the local people, for he was a withdrawn, angry man. Mrs. Fraser had died when Maggie was 8, and when the Frasers were still living on the Isle of Skye. Maggie remembered her as a bitter woman, with a red nose and pale grey eyes, with a thin body wrapped in an old tartan shawl. One day she had been found dead of a heart attack, and Maggie had spent long, miserable days and nights tortured with guilt, for she had found she could not feel one bit of sorrow or loss. It was shortly after his wife's death that John Fraser had announced they were moving to the mainland. Where he got the money from was a mystery, but Maggie was allowed to wear shoes for the first time in her life. The excitement of the journey was soon dimmed by her father's hectoring bad temper. Without Mrs. Fraser as a butt, Maggie had realized gloomily she would now have to bear the full brunt of her father's spleenish bad temper. The shop was finally reached. Maggie took the heavy iron key which she kept tied on a string around her waist and cautiously opened the door. Silence. She heaved a sigh of relief. The shop was dim and smelled of pepper and bacon and cheese. Pale yellow light came in through the thin blind over the shop door. Maggie went into the small kitchen at the back of the shop, opened the iron lid of the stove, and threw in some pine cones and torn newspapers and lit the fire. The rain, heavy now, drummed on the tin roof of the kitchen, which was a makeshift extension to the small building. She pushed open the back door and leaned against the jamb. There was no garden to speak of, only a scrubby area of wild lupins, broom, tussocky grass, and old cardboard boxes. Maggie remembered the books she had been reading that afternoon. She did not borrow books from the library and take them home, knowing her father would burn them, but rather contented herself with a half-day a week's orgy of reading. Although Maggie still thought in Gaelic, she had learned to read and speak English very well, her voice soft and lilting. The story Maggie had been reading that afternoon had been about a poor girl who had been courted by a handsome lord. But she had spurned his advances in favor of those of her country swain. It had all been very disappointing because Maggie had quite fallen in love with the handsome lord, who was a terrible rake, but he had been killed in the Boer War, atoning his sins by dying for queen and country. Suddenly, all the fear of what her father would be like on his return struck her, and she began to shiver. When she was much younger, Maggie had firmly believed in the fairies, and had left little gifts of milk and oatcakes for them, creeping out in the middle of the night when her father was asleep, and laying her small offerings by the kitchen door, and silently begging the wee folk to take her father away. But the next day, the oatcakes and milk would be gone, but John Fraser would be very much present. It was only when Maggie found a very fat hedgehog wandering away from the empty milk saucer one morning that she realized it had not been the fairies who had been enjoying her gifts. She returned to the kitchen and put a couple of logs on the fire and, taking the lid off the top of the stove, swung the heavy griddle, which served as a frying pan, over the flame.